and this is The Primary Nerd. Welcome, everyone. I'm Courtney, and I'm joined by my co-host, Brian.
Hi, everybody.
And this is Titanic Episode 6.
Yay!
Yay! We
right.
are back. I am excited. So much has happened since we recorded our last episode. So on the positive side, I got a promotion at work, and so now I am teaching for my company, which is just so incredibly exciting. So I was working on my lesson plans for that classroom and had to, put a pause on the podcast just for a moment. But we are back. We have regained our momentum, and we're exciting. Speaking of exciting, Dad.
Oh yeah. We have big news. So now, not only can you catch us on our website, theprimarynerd.com, but we have expanded to 3 other platforms. So now, 2 other platforms, but we have 4 total now. So you can listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, as well as our website. So, and of course, on the website, that's where our sources, visual aids, that's where you can see them that we reference during our episodes. So, theprimarynerd.com is where you want to be able to catch those visual aids.
Which I was always hoping to expand to additional platforms. I did not anticipate it happening so soon, but
I didn't either.
So excited.
Well, it's interesting to me because going through the information on the internet about how to do these things, it actually gave me I get differing information. So
it sounded very difficult to get onto Apple Podcasts. So I was like, man, we're gonna have to write applications and do all this stuff.
Well, that's what it made it sound like. But I actually found a website that gave very clear, simple, concise, easy information that I was able to get it done rather quickly. So I'm very glad for being able to find information like that on the internet.
So yay for Brian, because this was totally his achievement getting us out there. So
well, it definitely is a learning experience. So I love technology. I love to learn. So yes. So how about feedback? We have any feedback, Court?
Yes. So we have been getting quite a bit of feedback. We really want to give a shout out to the listeners who've contacted us. We love hearing from you guys, and we've gotten quite a bit of incredibly valuable feedback, insights, suggestions. You've really reminded us that the entire podcast is built on the foundation of listening to the historical voices with an open mind and heart, and we need to just continually be careful not to filter their words through our personal experiences.
Yes.
So we will be continuing to step outside of ourselves and our own understanding to remain open to what the historical voices are trying to tell us.
Yes, they went through the things they experienced in their lives. We just want to understand it from their perspective.
Step into their shoes.
Yes.
No shame, no shade.
Nope.
All right, so the plan for this episode, we are continuing our exploration of the Titanic saga from the passenger's perspective, beginning with the launching of the lifeboats. Throughout this episode, we will be referencing a particular image of the boat deck. You can access the image on our website, theprimarynerd.com. It will be under the Episode 6 header. I will tell you, it is an incredibly helpful visual aid. So, but another little cautionary, if you have not listened to episode 5 yet, I would encourage that you pause this episode and go listen to episode 5 first. This current episode will be building off of the information that was contained in episode 5 quite a bit. For those of you who have already listened to episode 5, here are some of the highlights that are especially important to keep in mind, especially since it's been a minute. So after reporting to the boat deck with life belts on as instructed, the first and second class passengers were left to their own devices with no instructions from the captain, officers, or crew. Because of the layout of the boat deck, these passengers could not congregate together in a large group. Instead, they were formed into smaller groups that drifted between the boat deck and the public rooms on Promenade Deck A for first class, or Bridge Deck B for second class. Remember, the third class passengers are going to be on Shelter Deck C, and we're going to be talking about their experience at a later date. Because the passengers were not assembled in one place, they could not be advised as a whole. Instead, the passengers were instructed by whichever officer was managing that particular section of the deck. The same tenets were not followed on both sides of the ship. The officers on the starboard side implemented a different process to load and launch their lifeboats, or the lifeboats for which they were responsible, versus the officers on the port side. And even on the same side of the ship, there are documented instances where the passengers were held to different standards. We'll get into some of that today. The instruction and advice given to the first and second class passengers was dependent on 3 factors. Number 1, on which side of the ship the passenger was standing. Number 2, which officer was giving the order. And number 3, the particular moment in time in which the order was given. As you will hear from the passengers in today's episode, the instructions given by the officers and crew directly affected each passenger's chance of survival. And it isn't a downward trajectory, because it would be like, well, duh, Courtney, as the night goes on and people are getting more panicked or things becoming more obvious, of course it's going to be harder to get in the lifeboat. Not even talking about that, man. Some people had a harder time earlier in the night, and then they were able to get off later, and it's just because of who they talked to at a particular moment in time. It's pretty wild. Mm-hmm. So when I first started writing this episode, I fully expected to tell this part of the Titanic story in the same way as those who came before me, by organizing the passengers' accounts according to the lifeboat in which they escaped, and then discussing the lifeboats in chronological order based on launch time. This approach involves zooming back and forth between the port and starboard sides, but it does allow the historian to work through the timeline with each launched boat as a milestone. And as we both know, Daddy, the timeline thing can be confusing.
Oh, yeah, it sure can.
So if we've got like a solid, hey, we know this happened at 1240, there is the desire to be like, hey, we at least know this.
When it comes to time, there are so many different things happening at the same time.
Yes.
And so, it makes sense what we've talked about and how you've decided to go taking a look at it. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
However, my fabulous, wonderful, brilliant co-host had a great idea. Dun, dun, dun. This really was his brainchild. Why not organize the passenger accounts according to the lifeboat in which they escaped? But instead of talking about the lifeboats in chronological order based on launch time, we focus on the passenger experience on the starboard side of the ship, and then switch focus to the port side. Mm-hmm. The passenger accounts clearly indicate that the 2 sides of the ship operated very differently, but why?
That's what we're going to be talking about.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I got, when Dad first mentioned this idea, why don't we do this? And I just was like, oh, it was such an exciting idea. So, by sorting the passenger recollections by lifeboat grouping, we would have forward starboard, aft starboard, forward port, aft port. This is going to allow us to analyze the conditions and variables that differentiated the 2 sides of the ship. The goal, of course, is to understand how these factors affected the choices that the passengers made.
Yes, that was in that moment in time, like you had said, mm-hmm. the points above. Yes, that moment in time, who they spoke to and what their impressions were of the situation of the ship that affected the choices that they made.
The information that's being conveyed, the atmosphere, the attitudes. I mean, all of this plays a role. And so by stacking them all together in the neighborhoods, remember Henry Harper talked about the neighborhoods mm-hmm. of people? Yep. By focusing on these different neighborhoods of people, kind of like their own stage that had their own director and their own set of circumstances, we're going to be able to hopefully glean an understanding about why this section worked in this way as opposed to the others.
Yes.
Instead of jumping back and forth between the boats all over the ship. So, I don't want to give the wrong impression. Just because we are analyzing the 2 sides separately does not mean that they're independent of one another. The starboard and port sides were 2 halves of a whole, and the passengers by no means stayed on one side of the ship the entire night. In fact, at one point, crowds of passengers crossed from the starboard side to the port side because there was a rumor that men were being allowed to board the lifeboats on the port side. So just keep this in mind. It's not like there was a concrete wall or anything. But this is the methodology that we're going to be using for the lifeboat episodes. This episode will be highlighting the passenger experience in the forward starboard neighborhood of Titanic.
Good place to start.
Yes, so where we left off last episode, Titanic was traveling through the North Atlantic on her way to New York when she collided with an iceberg at 11:40 p.m. Sunday night, April 14th, 1912. The collision inspired some of the passengers to investigate, but most returned to their cabins after being reassured by the officers and crew. However, sometime between midnight and 12:15 a.m., on the 15th, Captain Smith issued the order for the passengers to grab their life belts and report on deck. Following Titanic's design flow, the passengers exited onto their assigned decks, where they waited to be told that they could return to their cabins. Some of the passengers occupied themselves by watching the crew as they uncovered the lifeboats and attached them to the davits. Few, if any, suspected that they soon would be boarding those very boats. And so, with that, let's go back in time.
Passengers were still enduring the biting cold and piercing sound of steam blowing off while they waited for instructions. Most believed that they would be told to go back to bed, but the long wait ended with a surprise. The officers began walking around the boat deck and through the public rooms calling for women and children to step forward. First-class passenger Lucy Duff Gordon had a difficult time accepting this turn of events, saying, quote, "Outside we saw officers and other crewmen swarming over the lifeboats which have been uncovered and were being swung out and ready for lowering. This was startling to see. Although we had been warned by the stewards to be prepared for going away in a boat, it simply did not seem possible that all this was actually happening. We stood there quite some minutes as the officers called for women and children. Few seemed to want to brave the dark sea in an open boat, and it was only after considerable coaxing that many went at all." And another order soon followed, that all women and children make their way to the port side of Promenade Deck A. According to first-class passenger Henry Harper, quote, "Not long after the passengers began telling one another that we were ordered to put on life preservers, stewards came around our neighborhood and began calling out, 'All women to go to the lower deck.' Some women went. Others were escorted down the companionway by their husbands. I take it that they all understood, as we certainly did, that the women were to be kept together. They were ready to be sent off in the first boats if it should become necessary to abandon the ship. My wife and I said nothing to each other, but simply sat still and waited." So ignoring the captain's orders worked out for the Harpers. As soon after Captain Smith ordered women and children to report to Promenade Deck A, first-class passenger Hugh Woolner realized the flaw in this plan. Woolner testified to the following during the U.S. Senate inquiry, quote, "The captain said, 'I want all the passengers to go down on A deck because I intend they should go into the boats from A deck. I remembered noticing as I came up that all those glass windows were raised to the very top, and I went up to the captain, saluted him, and said, "Haven't you forgotten, sir, that all those glass windows are closed?" He said, "By God, you are right. Call those people back." Very few people had moved, but the few that had gone down the companionway came up again, and everything went on all right. So, to clarify, Captain Smith had previously captained the Olympic, which was the sister ship of the Titanic. And although the two ships were almost identical, the Olympic's first-class promenade deck on Deck A was completely open to the elements, whereas the forward portion of Titanic's first-class promenade was partially enclosed, with glass windows that could be opened with a special crank. Historians assume that when Captain Smith instructed for the forward lifeboats to be lowered to Promenade Deck A, he had forgotten this crucial design difference. So, Courtney, why would boarding a lifeboat from Promenade Deck A be any different from boarding from the boat deck?
So, everything that I've read is that Captain Smith thought that it would be safer. It would be an easier, safer experience for the women and children to load from Promenade Deck A as opposed to boarding from the boat deck. The best example I can think of was it would be the difference between standing on the roof of your home and stepping out onto a raised platform versus standing on a covered porch with columns and railings to hold onto, then stepping out onto a raised platform.
Okay, that would make sense, because that would be a little unnerving to be standing on I would assume there was a railing or whatever.
Yes.
And they just would have been stepping out into a boat where there's nothing on the sides, really not much to hold on to, whereas you had the structure of a deck down below where there's a roof, sides, rails,
yes.
all of that. That would be a little more comforting, I would think.
And to talk a little bit more about Promenade Deck A, because I did quite a bit of research into this, is I thought that it was the big windows that could be lowered that were on the front. That is not the case. It is these little those kind of like rounded windows that you see in an airplane.
Mm-hmm.
So it's glass, it's in there, it's small. You certainly don't imagine like a person fitting through it, but imagine it being slightly bigger, and then the forward windows were all of that nature. And so you would have to take a special crank, stick it in there, and you could actually crank down that window to go down into the wall
mm-hmm.
of the promenade deck. So that would be at the forward. And in the The aft, those were these really big, like, picture windows that could be opened.
Oh, interesting. Did those have to be cranked as well?
No. So
Oh.
that's why they had a much easier time dealing with opening up those windows for the aft lifeboats as opposed to the forward lifeboats
Very
with these
good.
special small windows with the crank.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for explaining that.
Yes, I had to look this up because I was like, wait, why? So Woolner's conclusion that everything went on all right seems like an overly optimistic interpretation of these events. Some passengers obediently followed Captain Smith's orders and descended the stairs from the boat deck to Promenade Deck A just to be turned around and marched back up again. Some, like the Harpers, ignored the order and never left the boat deck. Others went down to Promenade Deck A but chose to stay there instead of going back up to the boat deck as instructed. One of the passengers that was caught up in the boat deck promenade deck confusion was first-class passenger Edith Rosenbaum. She later gave an interview to the Ladies' Home Companion saying, quote, "An order was then given out, all women will kindly go to the boat deck, women only. I went up to the boat deck and remember seeing men standing about. An order was then issued, women will please return to A deck. Again, I turned around, wondering what it all meant. The order was then given, women, go back again to the boat deck. Frankly, I did not know what it meant, so I went into the lounge and sat in an armchair. There were 4 or 5 gentlemen seated around, and one of them said to me that he heard they had launched 5 boats. Surely there is no danger, I said, and he answered, no, but the English are great people for rules and regulations. They are the greatest sticklers for this sort of thing. I replied, if it is only a question of rules and regulations, I do not propose to go out on that deck and freeze to death. Just then I spied an officer, and said to him, tell me, Mr. Officer, shall I leave in a lifeboat? Is there any danger? To which he replied, I do not think there is any immediate danger, but this boat is damaged, and she certainly cannot proceed to New York. She may be towed into the nearest harbor. We expect the Olympic along in the next 2 or 3 hours. She will take the passengers off and proceed with them, but there is no immediate danger, as she is an unsinkable boat. And madam, you can use your own judgment in the matter.
Wow, an unsinkable boat.
So basically, there's so many conflicting orders that Edith just gives up, goes inside and gets a seat in the first-class lounge on Promenade Deck A. Her decision was reinforced by the officer's blasé attitude, and any sort of momentum generated by the orders to come on deck with lifebelts seems to have been negated by the conflicting orders.
Yeah, because conflicting orders, you're just like, okay, what is going on here? What do we need to do? Tell us what, be clear about what the situation is and what we need to do. But by being conflicting, it's people are going to soon lose heart and, okay, well, these guys, maybe there isn't really a problem, or maybe, they don't know what they're up to, and you just give up, like Edith did.
Okay, so I gotta tell you, I have a personal story that kind of connects with this. It reminds me a lot of the Henry Harper, where he didn't even bother to leave the boat deck. So we had to fly to California recently, and we're at the airport. We're trying to get through TSA, and it is coming down to the wire. We need to get through TSA to make our flight, and all of a sudden they start calling, hey, anybody going to DFW, which is Dallas-Fort Worth, you guys all need to move to this line. And so we're like, oh, okay, excellent. They're going to move us to this line. They're going to put us through because our flight is the next one to leave. So we all move over to this line. And then all of a sudden, everybody that had been in line behind us, that were still in the line that we left, they start pushing them through. So yeah, we did not get any benefit whatsoever by following those instructions. Everybody ahead of us made it through TSA first.
And you had to wait.
And we had to wait. And there was a guy behind me. I thought he was going to lose his mind. He was trying to inspire a riot in the middle of the airport. But I can see where, because there's what the passengers think is happening, or what this implies, versus what the crew knows is about to happen, or what they're trying to have happen.
And since there was no one way of letting everyone know, there was a lot of confusion and a lot of conflicting information.
Exactly. So, and we've got all this confusion. We've got the momentum is kind of gone. People are just confused now and giving up. And the first lifeboat has not even launched yet.
Oh, wow.
So it's at this point in the timeline that the discrepancy begins between the starboard and the port sides of Titanic. In the following quote, first-class passenger Dr. Washington Dodge lays out his observations and analyzes why such a significant discrepancy existed. Quote, at no time were there many people on the starboard side that night. Why was that? The most reasonable explanation that I can give is that the captain was in charge of the launching of the boats on the port side. Now, in times of danger, the captain always draws a crowd. The more notable men on board, who were known by sight to the other passengers, knew Captain Smith personally and remained near him. These men attracted others. In this way, the crowd grew on the port side, while at no time was there anything like a crowd on the starboard side. Again, the orders for women and children to go to the port side greatly increased the number there. Now, this condition may explain many things. It may explain why the boats were launched from the starboard side so much more quickly and successfully, and why, when the last boats on this side were reached, numbers 13 and 15, there were practically no women around and not many men. When the order to launch the boats was given, Captain Smith took command of the port side and never left there. Chief Officer Murdoch took command of the starboard side. What the conditions were on the port side of the vessel, I had no means of observing. It would have been impossible, even in daylight, to have obtained a view of but a limited portion of this boat deck. We only knew what was going on about us within a radius of possibly 40 feet.
Yeah, because they were in their neighborhoods.
They're in their little neighborhoods.
The buildings were in between, and the distance from the forward to the aft, so it would have been difficult to see.
So obviously, we've heard the last bit of that quote from Dr. Washington Dodge before, and this is not the only time we will hear this quote from Dr. Washington Dodge again. We will revisit his observations and discuss the implications in more depth during the port episode. But for today, Dr. Washington Dodge has identified two factors that were instrumental in creating the environment on the starboard side. Number one, Captain Smith was not present on the starboard side. He was on the port side and stayed there all night. Number two, the women and children were specifically ordered to go to the port side of Promenade Deck A. The combination of these two factors means that the starboard side of Titanic did not have as large a population of passengers as the port side. While the officers on the port side were caught up in the boat deck versus Promenade Deck A issue, the officers on the starboard side quickly began loading the forward starboard lifeboats from the boat deck. Therefore, this is the first neighborhood of lifeboats that we will be discussing. The forward starboard lifeboats are numbers 1, 3, 5, and 7. They were located on the boat deck it crossed between the officers' promenade and the first class promenade. Boats number 1 was the closest to the command bridge at the bow, while number 7 was almost amidships. We will be stating the number of people loaded into each lifeboat, but please note the number of people in each lifeboat is a combination of passengers and crew members. Interesting note, the forward starboard lifeboats only contained first-class passengers and crew. To help clear up any confusion, we have posted an incredibly helpful visual aid on our website, theprimarynerd.com, under our sources page for episode 6.
The first lifeboat launched from Titanic was boat number 7. It was lowered at 12:40 a.m. with 28 people aboard. First-class passenger William Sloper describes the circumstances that surrounded the loading and launching of number 7. Quote, "The covers had been taken off the lifeboats and they were quickly swung off on the davits and lowered to the level of the deck. From this deck we were, if I remember correctly, somewhere about 80 feet above the water, and to leave a well-lighted ship at that time seemed to have listed slightly and step out into a small boat that might plunge down into the darkness below, or if it reached the sea safely, be capsized by the water, was a question which made some people hold back. Miss Gibson, who was now in a state of high nervous excitement, made toward the first boat, and for fear that she might misstep or jump, I kept hold of her arm, and I remember trying to keep her by saying, 'Keep a stiff upper lip.' When the officers in charge of the first boat motioned for us to step in, she stepped forward with her mother and the gentleman who had been playing cards with us, and I helped them into the boat and followed after them. People sort of hung back at this time. Many men wouldn't leave the ship or let their friends, as they couldn't believe that the ship could really go down. Colonel Astor was directly behind me with Mrs. Astor, and he suddenly drew back and pulled his wife back with him. When 29 people, including 3 of the crew, were in the boat, and as nobody else seemed ready to follow, the officer on the deck gave word to lower away. We might have taken a few more people and managed somehow, although the boat was pretty well filled. When the people above on the Titanic saw the first 2 or 3 lifeboats get away safely, they eventually decided to come too, for the rest of the boats on our side quickly filled and were lowered. I feel that I owe my life to the fact that the young lady lost control of herself and went into the boat first, pulling me after her. My inclination was to stay aboard and wait a while until we saw whether there really was danger of the ship sinking. Later on, when they wouldn't let the men go, I could not have left." Wow.
I mean, there's so much in this account
there
to
is.
talk about. So, I mean, obviously, from the get-go, the starboard side, even, yes, it's women and children, but there's no problem in the beginning of them letting men go. And then when Sloper is talking about 29 people in the boat, and then on the visual aid that you see on our website, you're going to notice that it says 28. There is a bit of, there's always debate. Surprise, there's
Always
debate.
Yes, yes.
So, I mean, we have a hard time knowing, people don't even agree on how many people were traveling on Titanic, how many people survived Titanic. They certainly don't agree on how many people were in each boat, okay?
Yeah.
But the visual aid that we have, it definitely lines up with the prevailing historical understanding.
Right.
Okay,
well, there's so much going on. I mean,
yes.
I can imagine there'd be differing accounts.
Yeah, so if it's plus or minus 2 people, I'm still inclined to be like, hey, that's pretty darn good. So just so you're aware, in case you're not like, hey, what? And then it's interesting because Sloper's statement infers that the others began to board the lifeboats not because they were all of a sudden convinced Titanic really was in danger, but rather they decided that the lifeboats were not as dangerous as they had first appeared.
Yeah, because I mean, there was no statement or anything coming out saying this is where the problem with the ship. Some people knew that it was going to be sinking, but most people didn't. So they were just going by the information that they're being told and the attitudes of the people around them. So
yeah, it would be kind of like if we're on an airplane and then all of a sudden the stewardess comes up to us and goes like, oh, hey, by the way, please put on this parachute. We're going to be jumping out of the plane now. Why? Like, no mention of the plane is going to crash. There is no information. Just here you go. Please exit.
Right,
no.
Yeah, and not knowing why. Yeah, if you know why, it's a different story.
Exactly. So let's take a second and discuss what's entailed in lowering Titanic's lifeboats. Because for me, I've never been lowered in a lifeboat. So
neither have I.
To me, it's like, okay, we're getting in another boat. You went from one boat to another boat. But the passenger safety while being lowered overboard was completely dependent on just a few crew members manually lowering a wooden lifeboat 60 to 80 feet to the water below, while only equipped with ropes, pulleys, and physical strength.
That is some work. That is definitely some work. Wow.
Also, for the boat to remain level as it was lowered, the crew in the boat had to call instructions up to the sailors on deck if the boat started to tilt at one end or the other. Lower stern, lower aft, lower together.
Oh yeah, because I mean, if you didn't work together, you're going to basically be. It's going to be a problem.
It's going to tip over.
Yes.
Everyone's going in the water.
Yes. In second-class passenger Lawrence Beasley's memoirs, he describes hearing the ropes shriek as they passed through the pulley blocks. He described the lowering of the boat as such, quote, "The new ropes and gear creaking under the strain of a boat laden with people, we knew nothing of the apprehension felt in the minds of some of the officers whether the boats and lowering gear would stand the strain of the weight of our 60 people. The ropes, however, were new and strong, and the boat did not buckle in the middle as an older boat might have done. Whether it was right or not to lower boats full of people to the water, and it seems likely it was not, I think there can be nothing but the highest praise given to the officers and crew for the way in which they lowered the boats one after the other safely to the water. It may seem a simple matter to read about such a thing, but any sailor knows apparently that it is not so. I can only imagine that would have been a very difficult task with rope and tackle and a boat full of people and to keep it level and safe."
Well, and apparently one of the issues was that people are unpredictable in those situations, and they're wiggling around. It's kind of like when you would take me on the back of your motorcycle and you'd have to tell me you better sit like right behind me, don't move.
That's it.
Because if somebody does the wrong thing, this starts swinging. And they also talk about they were very lucky that night that there wasn't more waves, because the water was so still and so calm that if there had been any sort of waves or if it had been a stormy night, they talk about the boats potentially dashing against the side of the ship.
Yes, and they also said some of the event or their quotes state that they were standing in the boats. So yeah, if you had waves and you were standing, you can imagine how difficult that would have been to actually
remain stable.
Oh yes, to remain stable. So that was quite a feat for them to do that safely. So we'll continue on with first-class passenger Eleanor Caspier, who returned briefly to her cabin to grab a lifebelt, but had since returned to the boat deck and was standing near the forward starboard lifeboats as number 7 was being lowered. She later commented to her hometown newspaper, quote, A fact that is not generally known is that it was very hard for the men to coax the women into the lifeboats, and it became necessary for some of the men to get into the lifeboats first before the women would venture into them. So confident were they that the big steamship was absolutely unsinkable. Then again, some of the women absolutely refused to leave their husbands' sides, and it became necessary for Mr. Ismay and Mr. Andrews to use force in making some of the men get into the boats with the women folk so that they might be saved. So Eleanor Casbier's observation explains a surprising way in which first-class passenger James McGow boarded lifeboat number 7. Quote, he said, quote, "After procuring our life preservers, we went back again to the top deck, and after reaching there discovered that orders had been given to launch the lifeboats and that they were already being launched at that time. They called for the women and children to board the boats first. Both men and women, however, hesitated and did not feel inclined to get into the small boats, thinking the larger boat was safer. I had my back turned looking into the opposite direction at the time and was caught by the shoulder of one of the officers, who gave me a push, saying, 'Here, you're a big fellow, get into the boat.' When our lifeboats left the vessel, we were directed to row away a short distance, feeling it would be but a short time until we'd be taken back on the Titanic."
So then, not only are we saying that men were being allowed to board, it's they were actively boarding men
Yes.
into the first boats.
Yeah, and like I say, it was different on, like you were saying, on either side. Port, starboard, forward, or yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so.
So for this neighborhood, this is something that we need to be keeping in mind, is that this is not, well, I guess we'll let these men come on. They are grabbing big dudes, and they are like, okay, big fella, it's your turn.
There you go.
So the second lifeboat to be loaded and launched was boat number 5, which was just forward of where boat number 7 had been. It was launched at 12:45 a.m. with 36 people aboard. First-class passenger Eleanor Casebeer was still standing off to the side by the forward starboard lifeboats when Titanic's designer Thomas Andrews approached her. Now remember, Eleanor Casebeer is the one that had been like the dining companion of Thomas Andrews. She's the one that was talking about how the notifications were not in the cabins, but the frames were.
Gotcha.
So she knows him, he knows her. Eleanor recalled, quote, "He took me by the arm and led me to the lifeboat. I could not hear just what he said to me at the time on account of the din, but I saw him motion to me to get into the boat, which was about to be swung over the rail. I asked him why he did not get in also, and he said, 'No, women and children first.' Bruce Ismay was there also, helping to load the women and children into the boat. He was dressed in pajamas, in slippers, with a coat thrown over his shoulders. There were 37 people in the boat, and it could not hold any more at the time, as it would have been foolhardy to attempt to overload it, inasmuch as it would have buckled and broken in two from the extra weight, from the moment it was swung from the davits."
So they're thinking they're going to buckle and fall and break from the weight, even though
Yes.
they weren't filled to capacity.
And let's take a quick moment. Let's talk about this capacity issue, because this is going to come up again and again and again. And the capacity, it is said, and it's also on the visual aid that we posted on the website, is that the 16 wooden lifeboats had a capacity of 65. I do believe that it is lifeboat 1 and lifeboat 4, which they're smaller. I think they've got a capacity of about 40. And this doesn't touch the Engelhart boats, which are A, B, C, and D. Those are smaller. I actually would have to look up to see how much they're supposed to hold. But there's a consistent thought process amongst passengers and crew where they say, you know, if we did so much, it would have buckled, it would have broken, it would have whatnot. And so, but later during the U.S. Senate inquiry, where they're kind of teasing out this information, why didn't you load these boats more? The officers are pretty adamant, like, no, this would have been disastrous. And it comes out that there's something about an in-air capacity, so literally hanging in air, how many people could be on board, versus the capacity of it being in the water.
Ah, I see.
But
So
then,
less being lowered and more while it's in the water.
that in the water it can hold far more than it being up in the air, but apparently in the course of the inquiry, they kind of come out and they're like, except for that's not true. That might have been true with older lifeboats, with older ropes, with this, that, and the other, but that technically with Titanic, when they said capacity 65, they did mean it should have been capacity 65. But when we keep talking, because we're going to talk to multiple people today, they're going to talk about just how loaded and crammed their lifeboats are, and they never get anywhere close to 65.
Yeah, that's what makes me wonder about, it makes me think about the crew and were they trained in this? Did they know how to do it? It just because the quotes are from some of the passengers stating that there were not filled to capacity, but yet there was no more room in the boat. So it just makes me wonder, where's the discrepancy?
And we will discuss this more. This is going to be a consistent topic of conversation. But just for now, when you guys are hearing about, the capacity, it would have broken in two, I don't want you to get the wrong idea and be like, oh, it would have broken in two. It's not actually... Apparently, that not necessarily would have been the case. And later in the night, when the boats are actually loaded up into the 60s, and I think one of them is even 70 people are in it, it gets down to the water just fine.
Oh,
so
interesting.
Just hold this in mind.
Okay, put a pin in it.
But this is information. Again, we talk about the information and the understandings that they have that justify the decisions that they make. This is a big one, is the capacity of the lifeboats.
Very good. Thank you.
You're welcome. So Eleanor Casebeer is not the only passenger who discusses the capacity of the lifeboats and justifies it not being loaded further. Like Eleanor Casebeer, first-class passenger Dr. Washington Dodge had kept his family off to the side while boat number 7 was loaded and lowered to the sea below. Dodge, his wife Ruth, and their 4-year-old Washington Jr. occupied a cabin on Promenade Deck A. This meant that after the order for lifebelts was given, the Dodge family, quote, had to ascend only one short flight of stairs, and passing onto the boat deck on the starboard side were at once next to the forward lifeboats. I learned afterwards that the order was given by the officers for the women and children to go to the port side of the vessel. It was on this side that the captain had taken charge of the launching of the lifeboats. At the time we reached the boat deck, the first boat on the starboard side, number 1, was hanging over the side of the vessel from the davits. Side note, it's not number 1, guys. It's number 7.
Oh, number 7.
I'm just going to put this in here right now.
Spoiler,
So you're not like,
spoiler
where
alert.
are we? No, it's the first boat they get to. It is in fact number 7. It was hanging over the side of the vessel from the davits, and a few persons, men and women, were seated therein. The officer in charge was calling for women and children to fill the boat, but seemed to have difficulty in finding those who were willing to enter. I myself hesitated to place my wife and child in this boat, being unable to decide whether it would be safer to keep them on the steamer or to entrust them to this frail boat which was the first to be launched and which hung over 80 feet above the water. Which, can you imagine if you hit the water at 80 feet?
Oh, no.
I don't think you could survive that.
Swinging on davits with a bunch of people and the thing going, and then being lowered. The front goes a little bit
and
lower.
And a 4-year-old.
Oh, and children. And oh, my goodness.
I've got a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old. I would not, nope. They would be like trying to swing over the side. It would be a disaster. Which hung over 80 feet above the water. In the meantime, I busied myself with strapping on their life preservers and heard the officer give the command to lower away. This boat was launched with but 26 people in it, although its capacity was over 50, and about 1/3 were male passengers.
Interesting.
As I observed this boat lowered without accident, I placed my wife and child in the next boat. This boat was ordered lowered when it contained less than 35 persons. In neither case were additional women to be found. Each of these boats contained at least 10 male passengers. As I saw this boat lowered, containing my wife and child, I was overwhelmed with doubts as to whether or not I was exposing them to greater danger than if they had remained on board the ship.
So they're saying there's not many women. This is the starboard side once again, and there were not that many women. The captain's on the port side at this time, so you can imagine the crowd that was over there. So
Yes.
there's definitely a difference between the two sides.
Well, and he's acknowledging that it was called for women and children to go to port side Promenade Deck A, and they, just like the Harpers, are like, nah.
Nah.
That's not us. They did not get out of line to
Right.
go to DFW,
Yeah.
allegedly. They
Yeah.
stayed in line.
They stayed there. Yeah. So Dr. Washington Dodge says that. You're saying number 1 was first to be launched, but that you're right. That was actually number 7. Is what you're saying. So, but how would the passengers have known about the numbering system? They wouldn't have.
They wouldn't have known.
No.
They couldn't even figure out what the numbering system was for the decks.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, I mean, for them, maybe it was just the first one launched, so they figured maybe that was number 1.
well, okay.
So.
And I'm a very I don't know. I'm a very type A person, so it bugs me that they didn't do number one first. I'm like, really? We couldn't have just gone with number one. We had to go with 7.
No way. We're not going to abandon
Why?
the ship. It's got to be in.
It's
got to be in
gotta
numerical order.
in numerical order. Dang it.
Yeah,
So,
no, I don't think it
hey,
works.
I'm with him. I would have been like,
okay.
this isn't number one. Oh, that's weird.
So, first-class passenger Norman Chambers and his wife had climbed up to Promenade Deck A. There, the Chambers were given steamer rugs and directed up to the boat deck. And Norman remembered, quote, "All this time I considered that the lifeboats were merely a precaution. More passengers began coming out of the deck house, and we decided to go forward where the lifeboats were and see what was being done. We were instructed by a steward stationed there to go aft. Instead of doing this, we stepped behind the deck house and waited until people had apparently ceased coming and the steward was no longer there. Then we started forward again, and as nearly as I can remember, stopped at the last one of the forward starboard group of lifeboats. This was already swung out level with the deck, and to my eyes appeared sufficiently loaded. However, my wife said that she was going in that boat and proceeded to jump in, calling me to come. As I knew she would have gotten out again had I not come, I finally jumped into the boat, although I did not consider it, from the look of things, safe to put very many more people in that boat. I was followed by 2 more men who had come to join their wives at the last minute, as there appeared to be no more women in sight." So, interesting.
So let's pause and highlight a few things in this passage. So, number 1, Mr. and Mrs. Chambers are able to board boat number 5 because they actively circumvented the crew. They heard the command, you guys need to go aft. And again, they're like, nah. So they hide behind the deck house. They wait for that steward to go away. If the Chambers had gone aft as instructed, the forward starboard boats still would have launched without them.
Yes, they would have.
And then they would have been fighting for the limited seats in the aft starboard boats. And number 2, the aft starboard lifeboats do not launch until almost an hour after this point in time.
Oh, wow.
So why is the crew directing passengers to the aft boats if the forward starboard boats are being loaded and launched right away?
That doesn't make any sense. I mean, if you're not done in that area, why are you sending people somewhere else? I wonder what orders they were given.
I don't... This is one of those things that you're just like, wait a second, but why?
Well, why? Because they're still going to load the forward, the starboard forward lifeboats. They're still going to be lowered, still going to be launched. Why would you send people away?
And one of the things that we are going to discover is that the boats, on the starboard side specifically, as soon as there was no other people stepping forward, they were launching them. So it's not like they got them started, waited for more people, held them, and then launched them. Basically, as soon as it's like anybody else, okay, and you're gone.
It almost seems like it was a press for time, like they were feeling pressed and pushed to just get them off and in the water, rather than let's make sure that we're getting everyone that we can get in these boats.
And it's so interesting that you would bring that up. So let's continue with Norman Chambers' account.
Okay.
Quote, "I noticed a tall young officer clad in a long overcoat giving orders to another officer to go into our boat. As a parting injunction, he gave our officer instructions to pull alongside the gangway after the boat had reached the water. This in itself was a very particular order, as I was certain that none of the doors in the ship's side had been opened and had seen no activities in that direction." Keep in mind, this is Norman Chambers. This is our guy from Deck E. He's the guy who saw the water in the mail hold. He's the one who was talking to the officers. So we know that he was actually down on Deck E. So if he had seen gangway doors opened down there, or if gangway doors had been opened down there, he very likely would have seen them open. So, but, put a pin in that.
Okay.
And to continue with him, he says, "Before lowering, I heard someone in authority say, that is enough before lowering. We can get more in after she is in the water."
Interesting.
It is worthy of note that there were but 35 of us in a lifeboat, which the Board of Trade registers as having a capacity of 60 people, and we were crowded, the boat being just manageable. When we were finally in the water, the passengers were so tightly packed in a standing position that the little quartermaster had great difficulty in crawling between our legs to reach the trigger amidships for releasing the falls simultaneously.
Well, there's the going around to the gangway. That could be what you were talking about earlier about the number in the air, the number in the water. I wonder if part of their process in this in launching lifeboats was to launch it with partially filled and then have this process of getting people through the gangways to, top them off. But if it was a stormy sea, that would be really difficult.
Well, and this does seem to be a crucial piece of the puzzle because I had read through a ridiculous amount of testimony before I got to Lightoller, and Lightoller, spoiler alert, he's on the port side. He does end up sending crew to go down to open gangway doors. He also sends another crew member remembers being sent to get a Jacob's ladder because I was going like, how in the heck would they have even gotten them from the gangway down into the boats? Like, there's still pieces of this puzzle that are missing, but there does appear to be this secondary plan. Get the boats in the water, get them to the gangway, and then we'll be able to continue the loading from there. So let's discuss the orders that Norman Chambers overheard because it is a crucial piece of the puzzle. Gangways are openings in the side of a ship into which a gangplank fits so that passengers can embark or disembark. On Titanic, there were various gangways that allowed passengers of different classes to enter their designated areas. Obviously, third class needs to be getting into their own special spot, second class into theirs, first into theirs. The officer that Norman Chambers overheard seems to have planned for the launched lifeboats to pull alongside the ship just under the gangway doors so that the lifeboats could be filled further once they were in the water. This could explain how the officers justified launching partially filled lifeboats.
But how was that order given to the passengers to be able to get down there? I mean, if that was the case.
That is the missing. We will read over and over again the officers and even the captain telling the people in the lifeboats, pull alongside. Pull alongside.
Interesting.
And then some of the boats are told to make for a light out in the ocean. So those are kind of two of the directions that stand out. But then when it comes to, like you said, passengers being able to get them off the ship into the lifeboat, I mean, were they just anticipating having them jump? Like, this is the part that seems to be missing in the plan.
Interesting.
So
Norman Chambers' observation is supported by the following quote from second-class passenger Lawrence Beasley. Quote, "Looking forward and downward, we could see several of the boats now in the water, moving slowly one by one from the side, without confusion or noise, and stealing away in the darkness which swallowed them in turn as the crew bent to the oars. An officer, I think first officer Murdoch, came striding along the deck clad in a long coat. From his manner and face evidently in great agitation, but determined and resolute, he looked over the side and shouted to the boats being lowered, 'Lower away, and when afloat, row around to the gangway and wait for orders.' 'Aye, aye, sir,' was the reply, and the officer passed by and went across the ship to the port side."
There you go.
But it would have been. Have you read any quotes where passengers were given orders to go to the gangway?
No.
None. Okay.
Okay, but keep in mind, I do not have access to all archival research.
Gotcha.
If we start a Patreon, maybe this is something we can work towards. But from the accounts that I have read, I have not seen anything where the passengers were told that you need to make your way to this gangway door.
Interesting. It makes me wonder how many the crew on the boat that night, how many had actually, if they ever had gone through something like this, if they had ever gone to the extent of loading and lowering all the lifeboats and opening the gangway, going through the process.
I am going to go through that in the crew episodes.
Oh, okay.
And there you go. There's a plug for future episodes. We will be talking about this in the crew section of our Titanic series.
Okay, and at that same time, weren't there some rockets that went off?
Yes, there were. Around the same time that boat number 5 was being lowered, so around 12:45 a.m., the passengers' attention was abruptly pulled skyward. To the astonishment of all, distress rockets were being fired into the air above Titanic. First-class passenger Lucy Duff Gordon, who can always be counted on for a colorful description, remember she's our gal who hates the rowdy Americans, said, quote, "Presently a rocket, terribly loud and bright, was set off near the bridge, and everybody lifted their heads to watch it shooting up, searing the night sky. It was an awesome spectacle, almost as if we were suddenly transported to some macabre fairground." Second-class passenger Lawrence Beasley immediately understood the implications of this latest development and commented, quote, "If there were any who had not by now realized that the ship was in danger, all doubt on this point was to be set at rest in a dramatic manner. There was a rush of light and a hissing roar, and with a gasping sigh, one word escaped the lips of the crowd: rockets. Anyone knows what rockets at sea mean, Everyone knew without being told that we were calling for help from anyone who was near enough to see.
Wow, that must have been quite a sight. And I'm wondering if the steam was probably still blowing off at that time too. So you have
It
rockets,
was going for about
steam.
an hour afterwards, so
Yes. So what a sight, and the noise. Oh my goodness. So the third lifeboat to leave Titanic was boat number 3. It was launched at 12:55 a.m. with 32 people aboard. First-class passenger Clara Hayes was traveling on Titanic with her husband Charles, married daughter Orion, and son-in-law Thornton Davidson. After the sinking, various newspapers made false statements about the disaster and claimed to have obtained the information from Clara Hayes. To combat this misinformation, Clara decided to share her story. Quote, "Shortly after the Titanic ran into the iceberg, we went on deck and Mr. Hayes went back to the cabins to get fur coats for us as the night was very cold. All imagined there was no immediate danger of the steamer sinking, and in spite of the fact that the boats were already being loaded, it was thought to be the best course to pursue to remain with the ship. However, according to historian Hugh Brewster, Mr. Hayes appears to have had a change of heart. He told his daughter, 'You and your mother go ahead. The rest of us will wait here till morning.'" So, it makes you wonder, did the shooting of the distress rockets, did any of that, could that have changed his mind
Was he one of those people that was like, she's only going to sink so far.
And we got help coming.
We got coming,
this,
but
yeah.
let's just get the women folk off, just to be safe.
Okay. But believing that they would all be reunited soon, Orion boarded the lifeboat without kissing either her father or husband goodbye. Clara Hayes recorded, quote, "As the second-to-last lifeboat was swung over the steamer's side, Mr. Hayes informed me that he and Mr. Davidson would wait until help came in the morning. They then wrapped warm coats around us and helped us, with our maid, into the boat. The last we saw of Mr. Hayes and Mr. Davidson, they were standing on the deck waving to us in the boat, and as a further assurance, Mr. Hayes called out that the Titanic was assuredly good for 10 more hours, and by that time help would have surely arrived." So, yeah, so this is boat number 3. That was the third lifeboat out of 20, correct?
It is. It is the third boat to launch out of 20. Mm-hmm. And then she had made a comment that she was calling it the second to last lifeboat.
No,
absolutely not.
Well, maybe just from where she stood. That's what she thought.
But number 3 is the second to last of the forward starboard lifeboats.
And maybe in her neighborhood, that was all she could see.
Well, and if we think about it, again, if you're standing in your neighborhood and you've got all the buildings between you and the port side, so you can't see what's happening down there, and then from the forward starboard section to the aft starboard section is 200 feet.
Right.
That's 2/3 of a football field.
Yep.
And that's all the way down in the second-class promenade area.
Mm-hmm. Right, so her comments further proves Dr. Washington Dodge's comment about the passengers' lack of visibility. They could not really see what was going on in other places unless they were to physically go and move to forward, aft, port, starboard, wherever it may be.
And I can imagine that in a moment of stress, it is hard to look beyond your immediate circumstances in any moment of stress.
Yes.
Okay. So to try to think about these other areas, I can very well see that people would just be like, I got to focus on what I can see and what I can deal with right here.
Right, and they're right there. That's their opportunity to get on the boat and get out. Well, in this case, there was people that were, maybe we should stay on the ship, maybe we should go. So there were still some people on the fence. Mm-hmm. So, but first-class passenger Henry Harper and his wife.
It's either Mira or Mina.
Mira.
I've seen it both ways.
Okay, Mira or Mina. Boarded a lifeboat as soon as possible. He later wrote, quote, "I handed my wife down into the nearer bigger boat and she comfortably seated herself on a thwart. Other women and other men climbed aboard. 4 or 5 stokers or some such men came along and jumped into the boat at the forward end. The sailor who seemed to be in charge of the boat laughed a little. 'He said, I suppose I have to go get my gun and stop this.'"
Which I'm sure the stokers did not want to have happen.
It was interesting to see here stokers are on the boat. But
this is the first time we've heard of anybody.
Yeah, true.
Not first class or a sailor.
Yeah, but continuing with the quote, "But he did not go and get any gun, and neither did he order the stokers out. Everybody seemed to take what was happening as a matter of course, and there wasn't a word of comment. I stepped in and sat down among the stokers. There was no one in sight on the decks. I had on my arm a little brown Pekingese spaniel we had picked up in Paris and named Sun Yat-sen. I found out, after boarding the Carpathia, that several dogs had been rescued in the same way in the early boats. there seemed to be lots of room, and nobody made any objections. So yeah, so here you have stokers. They're supposed to be separate from everybody, especially first class.
They're never supposed to even be seen, and
Right.
they're coming up on deck and they're ready to leave. Let's
Wow,
go
with the first class passengers.
with the first class passengers.
Probably all grubby from coal and everything else.
Probably.
They got going. Yeah.
I think it's hilarious that the officers laughing. Huh, I probably should stop this. You know,
Wow.
like
Yes.
they're just rolling with it. Nobody really knows what's up. We're all just going with it. Let's talk about the Titanic dogs, though. So the first time, I mean, obviously in the movie, they've got the dogs that go down into the, the poop deck and whatnot. And they're, making comments about, oh, this is where we fit in the world, is we're down here where the dogs go. And But then when we went to the Titanic Museum up in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, they had a whole thing on the Titanic dogs, and I had absolutely no idea. So I did some additional research. There are 12 confirmed dogs that were traveling on Titanic. There was a Cavalier King Charles Spaniel, a Fox Terrier, a French Bulldog, 2, would you say Airedale?
I'd say Airedale.
Airedale Terriers. One of the Airedale Terriers was named Kitty and was owned by Colonel John Jacob Astor. There was a Great Dane, 2 Pomeranians, a Pekingese, a Chow Chow, and 2 others of unknown breeds. It was really expensive to board a dog on Titanic. According to the National Museums of Liverpool, a dog's fare was just as costly as a child's.
Oh, my goodness.
I know, right?
Wow.
So you can take your kid or you can take your
your dog.
puppy.
Yeah.
Apparently, this did not deter the first-class Americans who refused to be parted from their pets as they were traveling the globe. And because the business plan of the White Star Line revolved around catering to the desires of the highest echelon of society, Titanic was equipped with a first-rate dog kennel, which was most likely located at the base of the dummy fourth funnel on the boat deck. The dogs were treated with the utmost care by the crew. They got daily walks and exercise. There are sources that state there was supposed to be an informal dog show scheduled for Monday, May 15th. For obvious reasons, that event never happened.
Oh, yeah.
Although the dogs traveling on Titanic were supposed to remain in the dog kennel on the boat deck, some of the first-class passengers smuggled their furry companions down into their staterooms. First-class passenger Helen Bishop remembered that her little frou-frou was, quote, the pet of the ship. The steward would not let me take her to the butcher. He said she was too pretty, and she was the only one allowed to stay in the cabin. Now, when I first read that quote, I was like, why are we taking the dog to the butcher?
Yeah, why?
What?
Yeah, the butchers take care of the dogs. Yeah, I wonder about that.
As ominous as this quote sounds, apparently the ship's butcher was one of the crew members responsible for caring for the dogs that were kenneled on board.
Well, that's quite a combination. Butcher,
I know.
and the dam.
I don't like it.
No.
I'm just letting y'all know.
Yeah.
So out of the 12 dogs traveling on Titanic, only 3 survived.
Oh.
We've already met one of the survivors, Henry Harper's little Pekingese, who escaped in boat number 3. The other 2 were Pomeranians, one of which escaped in boat number 7, the other in boat number 6. What all 3 had in common is they were staying in their owners' staterooms instead of the dog kennel, and they were all small enough to be hidden under a jacket or wrapped in a blanket as their owners quietly got them aboard the lifeboat. There
Good
were
for them.
the 9 dogs who did not survive Titanic were the larger dog breeds that could not be hidden in a stateroom and therefore were boarded in the ship's kennel on the boat deck. After the collision, somebody opened the dog kennel to give the occupants a fighting chance for survival. There are 2 stories / legends that are particularly heartbreaking. Apparently, this one is pretty rooted in fact. We know that there was first-class passenger Anne Elizabeth Isham, and she had boarded Titanic with her Great Dane. On the night of the collision, she tried to get them to let her dog come into the lifeboat, but she was not allowed to bring him. So she opted to stay on the ship rather than leave him behind.
Oh, my goodness.
And so she is one of there's 4 female first-class passengers who do not survive Titanic. Anne Isham is one of those 4. And there is a legend that has been it's unsubstantiated, but there's a legend that the ship that came to get the Titanic bodies out of the ocean saw Anne floating amongst the other victims with her arms wrapped around her dog.
Oh, how sad.
I know,
What
my heart.
what love? I mean, what love for her dog?
It is one of those things that it's like, even if it's not true, she still stayed behind with her doggy so he wouldn't die alone.
Wow.
And the other story This one seems to just be purely rumor, purely legend, but it's something that has stayed around in the stories of Titanic, is that, allegedly, there was a Newfoundland named Rigel that belonged to First Officer William Murdoch. And according to the story, I guess the New York Herald printed this story, they claimed that Rigel was on board and that he was actually in the water, and he was barking to get the attention of the Carpathia's crew, which helped them to locate the lifeboats to save them.
Oh, wow.
However,
he survived the. Oh, yeah.
However, according to the Smithsonian and other sources, there's no record of Rigel. He's never mentioned in survivor accounts.
Okay.
The story really doesn't stand up, but it is something that it does get brought up quite often.
Interesting. Oh, wow. Yeah, that's, yeah, you would think that, well, there's a lot of information on Titanic, and there's a lot of stories, and there's a lot of things that are, you know, like you've talked about. There's just a lot of interesting myths and legends and everything else that have come out of this. So back to the loading of boat number 3. First-class passenger Vera Dick and her husband Albert were able to board together. Vera later gave the following description to the Washington Post, quote, "There were some terrible scenes. I saw fathers parting from their children and giving them an encouraging pat on the shoulders. I saw men kissing their wives and telling them that they would be with them shortly. One man said that there was absolutely no danger, that the boat was the finest ever built with watertight compartments, and that it could not sink. That seemed to be the general impression. Some of the people on the boat have said I was brave because I wanted to remain on board until the last and refused to take a seat in the first boat when the captain wanted to put me in. As a matter of fact, there were women older and more nervous than I, and I thought they should have the first chance. I realized the danger, but I am young and felt equal to the situation." Wow. I mean, that you can imagine that there were some people that probably felt very nervous and very anxious about what was going on, and other people may have just had a different mindset about the unsinkability or whatever the case may be.
And what's interesting to me is that if the nervous and anxious people are leaving in the first lifeboats, because remember, there was the ones that were running around saying, you know, there's a problem, there's a disaster, and there was the ones telling them there's absolutely no problem, the ship cannot sink, this is ridiculous, you know. So there's kind of there's those that are worried and there's the naysayers. So if all the worriers leave the ship first, that means that there's really nobody left to be pointing out that confirmation bias. They're already worried. They already think there's a problem. Anything else they're going to see, where the other people on the other side that are not worried, that they have their own confirmation bias, all of that clamor of worry is gone.
Right. I mean, the situation, it definitely would calm the situation.
Yes.
I mean, if there's people in a situation that are nervous and anxious, and if they're not there, then yes, the situation will calm. And that, you know, who knows, that could have affected people's outlook as to what they thought was going to happen and what they should do. I mean, there's a definite, that is a distinct possibility. So, and because there are people that did choose to remain on board. So there's a lot going on at that night, and a lot of not consistent or broad information. So there's a lot of different emotions and different mindsets going on at the time. So, you know, second-class passenger Charlotte Collier echoed this sentiment with what she observed while the lifeboats were being loaded on the second-class section of the boat deck. Quote, "The first lifeboat was quickly filled and lowered away. The lowering of the second boat took more time. I think all those women who were really afraid and eager to go had got into the first. Those who remained were wives who did not want to leave their husbands or daughters, or who would not leave their parents." So this is definitely something where, you know, if you're anxious and nervous, you would want to get in, and once that is done, then it's a different mindset in the crowd or in the neighborhood.
The vibe is going to change.
Vibe's going to change, yes. So first-class passengers Philip Mock and Emma Schabert were brother and sister, and they had stood off to the side while boat number 5 was being lowered overboard. By the time that the crew moved on to boat number 3, the siblings decided they were ready to leave Titanic. Surprisingly, they were told they could not both go. Emma later wrote to her sister, quote, "On deck, the first lifeboats were being let down. They had to be dropped 60 feet, and it was gruesome to see them being let down. Boy and I had resolved to stay together. As the boat was rapidly sinking, the order soon came, ladies only into the lifeboats. So one boat after the other left with women who were leaving their husbands behind. The great Mr. Ismay tried to make me enter the last boat on the upper deck. When I refused and it had gone, he said, 'You made a great mistake not to get into that boat.' I answered, 'It does not matter. I prefer staying with my brother.'" According to
This is so I always put it as Flow FLW. That's Fitch, Leighton, and Wormstead. They wrote On a Sea of Glass.
oh, thank you. The pair was denied access to the lifeboat 4 times. Oh my goodness!
But this is the same boat.
Same neighborhood, the same forward starboard side. Yes.
That Albert and Vera Dick have gone. Henry Harper and Mira/Mina have gone. Norman Chambers and Bertha Chambers have gone. We've seen many, many men who have already left. But Philip Mock gets turned away?
We don't want, but also here it talks about how now that they're talking about the ship is sinking. Okay, it's rapidly sinking. And as makes me wonder, was that something that was said by the officers? Is it something that the passenger picked up on their own, that Philip Mock and Emma Schabert? If there was all of a sudden a just this real sense of urgency and emergency, and hey, we got to get these boats in the water. Maybe that's why they were pushing for women and children. But if there weren't any women and children, why didn't they let the men board?
Which they had been doing the whole time.
Right,
so then the thought is, okay, all right. So have we entered the part of the night on the starboard side where now we are going to start seeing them get more picky? That's kind of your first thing. Is, okay, are we at that point? Well, let's check it out.
Okay.
Because we're still in our same neighborhood. We're still in forward starboard. So the fourth and final of the forward starboard lifeboats to launch was number 1. It was lowered at 1:05 a.m. It has 12 people on board.
12?
12. Notice I did not say 12 passengers. 12 people. Actually, quite a bit of that was crew.
Oh, okay.
The most notable of the passengers in boat number 1 were first-class passengers Cosmo and Lucy Duff Gordon. They, as well as Miss Francatelli, who was Lucy Duff Gordon's secretary, had ascended the grand staircase behind those ribald Americans and then waited just inside the entrance for a while before finally exiting onto the port side of the boat deck. They found it incredibly chaotic, they were very overwhelmed, and so they decided to go over to the starboard side. Fitch, Leighton, and Wormstead in On a Sea of Glass quotes Sir Cosmo as saying, quote, "We will go round to the starboard side. It may be better there. It can't possibly be worse." While the starboard side had less people, when they arrived, the atmosphere was definitely tense.
So it had changed.
It had changed. So first-class passenger Lucy Duff Gordon recalled, quote, "A sailor ran at us and tried to drag me away from Cosmo. Another had got hold of Franks is Miss Francatelli, who cried out to us. I pleaded with Cosmo not to let them take me away, to let us remain together. I told him I did not want to go without him. He relented and asked the men to release me. They were still going after poor Franks till she told them she was with us and would not go away alone, so they let her stay. This incident put us all in a frantic state, but we did not say so till later, when we agreed that it was then at that moment that we recognized we really were in the most dreadful danger. Directly before us, we saw a boat, smaller than the rest, being made ready. This is the one that has like the capacity of 40, just so you know. Okay. Almost all of those who'd been standing near seemed to have gone in it or retreated up the deck, which was now angled noticeably towards the bow. We could see no one else around us, and I felt the small boat was our chance to go away together. I asked Cosmo if we shouldn't try to get into it. He said no, we must wait for orders. But presently he thought better of it and asked the dear officers if we couldn't all get in. The officer was most kind and said, please do. I shall never forget how black and deep the water looked below us and how I hated leaving the big, homey ship for this frail little boat.
Oh my goodness, that would be a very scary endeavor. No doubt about it. Mm-hmm.
So this is after Philip has been turned away, and he will be turned away 3 more times, but now Cosmo is allowed in.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. So now we're heading back over. We're checking in with first class passenger Dr. Washington Dodge. After helping his wife and child into boat number 5, he had stayed on the starboard side watching the other lifeboats launch. He observed, quote, not a boat was launched which would not have held 10 to 25 more persons. Never were there enough women or children present to fill any boat before it was launched. In all cases, as soon as those who responded to the officer's call were in the boats, the order was given to lower away. So that's it. It is 1:05 a.m., and all the forward starboard lifeboats have now been launched. While the passenger accounts state that the boats were crowded, 3 out of the 4 lifeboats in this section were only filled to half their capacity, and multiples of them were significantly below the 50% mark. Mm-hmm. The lifeboats that we've talked about today were loaded and launched in a little more than a half an hour, But the experiences of the people in this neighborhood vary to a surprising degree.
Yeah, so this forward, starboard neighborhood.
Little
right?
neighborhood, exactly. So in the
Interesting.
beginning, we've got stokers, dogs, all whatever men were wandering by that are allowed in. The nervous people are leaving first. We hear this from William Sloper, where he talks about how anxious and nervous Dorothy Gibson is, and how she drags him into boat number 7. We hear about Vera Dick talking about women more older and nervous than herself, and her giving them the opportunity to take those first lifeboats. We see the starboard crew members not following their own orders. We have the crew member telling Norman Chambers and his wife, no, you got to go aft. But then the forward starboard boats are being actively loaded and launched, and they're filled with quite a few crew members.
Interesting.
So those crew members aren't going aft.
No.
We've got, the gangways as plan B to offload passengers into the already launched lifeboats, potentially. Philip and Emma, who are turned down 4 times total, but men and wives allowed in the exact same lifeboats.
So not things are not being done the same for everyone. There's definitely some differences in the way that they processed the passengers and getting the boats loaded. So
And it seems so contradictory to me. So like the boat's being launched as soon as the last person responds to the call, regardless of how full or not. It has a sense of urgency.
Yes.
But then allowing all those other people in or not, it's odd. It doesn't seem like there's any sort of real plan or policy in place.
right.
And then you've got Lucy and Miss Francatelli being grabbed by the crew members and practically thrown into waiting lifeboats, where they're acting like they're going to throw them into lifeboats. And you're like, wait a second, where did this come from? Mm-hmm. And then you've got Cosmo and Lucy being invited into boat number 1. Please enter our boat number 1. And you're just like, wait a second.
All right. There was a lot going on there, and there was no consistency, and there was no single person, well, except for the captain's orders. But when it came to actually in performing the task of getting people in the boats, there was no one person that was giving all the orders that you should do this or not do that.
Right.
So it was all left up to the individual crew members in those areas. So
Well, and keep in mind, we'll get into this more when we get into the crew episodes as well, but you have to have the crew members that are up on deck that are actually lowering the boat. But then you have to have crew members that are in the boat because you're supposed to have them to pull the oars. They're supposed to be able to navigate. They're also supposed to be in there to be calling up to the crew on the deck about the lower stern, lower aft, lower together. So every time a boat leaves, with it leaves a certain percentage of the crew.
yes. You have to have, they have to be on the boats. The people on the boats don't understand how the process
Or the passengers have no idea what they're doing.
The passengers have no idea.
So, but this kind of becomes a thing. So then maybe those more knowledgeable people have since left Titanic.
Oh, it could be. Or how prepared were they for this disaster? How, as a crew, as a new crew together, not working together, we had talked back several episodes back, how a lot of them had never worked with these people. They were new to the ship. Mm-hmm. So how did that play a part in launching these lifeboats and doing it, getting enough people in them? I mean, they did them safely. They got them in the water. Mm-hmm. So they did that well. But it had to have been a frightening experience for someone who had never done this before to all of a sudden have to do it in earnest and in an emergency situation. Mm-hmm. So it would have been stressful.
It would have. It really would have. And as we've mentioned before, the instruction and the advice that was given to the first and second class passengers is entirely dependent on 3 factors: on what side of the ship they are, the officer giving the order, the particular moment in time in which the order is given. And you can see where those factors can result in a very different final product.
Yes. It all depended on that moment in time, the decision and how that helped make the person made a decision based on that information about those factors. What the passengers would have done at that particular moment was whether they would survive or not. So that was very what a chaotic environment to be in, and I can't even imagine what that would have been like. So, but it's I really appreciate your research on this. I've learned so much.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
Yeah, this is just amazing. So. Thank you for that. And so we will be our next episode will be looking at
the aft starboard lifeboats.
Very good.
And then we will flip over to the port. The port will most likely be able to be handled in just one episode. We say that we shall see. You know,
we're doing our best to be as concise, but have it be as full and as rich the information of what the people actually went through, so you can we all can get an understanding for what happened.
And we looked through this episode to see, could we cut anything to be able to do the forward and the aft starboard in one episode, and the answer was not, without leaving out some really good detail that paints the scene and paints the picture. So I mean, if we're gonna do it, we want to do it right.
That is correct. So, and I just want a reminder for our listeners that we appreciate your comments, feedback, information, ideas for future episodes.
We have a list.
I am keeping a list. So you can reach out to us by email, theprimarynerdpodcast@gmail.com, or on our website, theprimarynerd.com. You can also leave a comment there, which will come to our email. And remember, you can hear us on Apple, Spotify, Google, and of course on our website. So with that said, we are going to sign off. So
I'm Courtney.
I'm Brian.
And this is The Primary Nerd.